Welcome to the Khalifa's Gambit, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, The Eastern Enigma, Tales from the Great Hiatus, playing in the year 1893. For years the world believed him gone, lost to the Reichenbach Falls. Yet it was only recently, in a hidden compartment of his old travel trunk, that I discovered the truth. Within were journals, penned in a complex cipher, which chronicled his adventures during those lost years. These are the tales of his great hiatus, an odyssey through the enigmatic East, where his singular methods were met with ancient mysteries. The first of these accounts I have managed to decipher takes us to the perilous sands of the Sudan, to a city simmering with intrigue. I present to you the singular case I have come to call the Khalifa's Gambit. Chapter 1. It was many months later, back in the familiar fog-bound confines of our Baker Street rooms, that Holmes first recounted to me the singular events that began in the blistering heat of Khartoum. He had been travelling under the guise of the Norwegian explorer Sigerson, a role he played with characteristic perfection. The air was thick with the scent of cardamom and dust. "Watson," he began, his eyes distant. I was seated in a dim tea-house, a place where the air itself seemed woven from whispers and the sharp clatter of ceramic cups, a constant hum against the oppressive sun. The low hum of conversation faltered. A man entered, his shadow falling long and sharp across the tiled floor. The newcomer was an officer, his uniform immaculate, despite the pervasive dust, his bearing ramrod straight, yet it was the desperation in his eyes that marked him. As he scanned the room, his gaze passing over the locals before settling upon the lone European in the corner. After a moment's hesitation, the officer strode forward, his boots striking the tiles with a sharp, rhythmic rap that seemed to cut through the room's low murmur like a knife. He stopped before Holmes's small table. "Mr. Sigerson, forgive the intrusion. I was told I might find you here," said Captain Karim Al-Jamil. "You have found him. Though I cannot imagine what business an officer of the Anglo-Egyptian army has with a humble student of topography," explained Sherlock Holmes. The captain glanced around, ensuring they were not overheard, before leaning closer. The scent of sun-baked wool and leather emanated from his uniform. "My name is Captain Karim Al-Jamil, and I seek not a geographer, but a man of particular talents. I come on a matter of the gravest importance, a matter of treason," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. "A serious charge," Holmes observed, his gaze sharpening, "particularly when levelled against one of your own. The fine, reddish dust on your boots, Captain, is not from the common thoroughfare. It is from the clay pits near the military prison. You come not from your barracks, but from visiting an incarcerated colleague," Sherlock Holmes noted. A flicker of astonishment broke the captain's rigid composure. He straightened, staring at the unassuming explorer as a new light of understanding and hope dawned in his features. "Then the tales are true. My friend, Lieutenant Arthur Bromley, has been arrested. They found a coded message in his private quarters, a dispatch detailing our patrol routes, seemingly intended for the Mahdist forces. He swears his innocence, and I believe him. He is a good man, but a naive one, and he is being used as a pawn," Captain Karim Al-Jamil answered. "And your superiors?" Holmes inquired, swirling the dregs of his tea. "They are convinced of his guilt, I presume," explained Sherlock Holmes. "Major Finch sees the message and sees a traitor. He will not entertain any other possibility. Bromley is to be court-martialed. His career, and likely his life, are forfeit. You are his only chance," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes fell silent for a long moment. The only sound the distant melodic cry of a water seller in the street. The intellectual puzzle of the situation, as was ever his way, seemed to weigh more heavily with him than the desperate plea for justice. A man framed, a rigid military mind, and at the centre of it all, a coded message that had baffled the army's finest. At last he looked up, his grey eyes piercing and clear. "Your friend's predicament is unfortunate. The prejudice of his commander is lamentable. But the cipher is intriguing. Show me this message, Captain." Sherlock Holmes noted. A wave of relief washed over the captain's face. He nodded curtly, his military discipline returning. "I have a copy. It is not safe to speak further here. My quarters are secure. We can examine it there, away from prying eyes," responded Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes gave a single decisive nod and rose from his chair, leaving a few coins upon the table that clinked softly against the wood. The game, as he was so fond of saying, was afoot, not in the damp streets of London, but under the unforgiving glare of the Sudanese sun. The room Captain Al-Jamil had secured for my friend was Spartan, a temporary cantonment against the oppressive Khartoum heat. A single oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows upon the whitewashed walls, filling the air with the faint, sharp scent of burning oil. Outside, the evening chorus of the city had begun, a low thrum of distant voices and unfamiliar insects. Within our walls the only sound was the dry rustle of paper as Holmes smoothed a copy of the infamous cipher upon a small wooden table, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as crisp and dry as the document before him. "It is a fascinating piece of work, Captain. Truly fascinating," replied Sherlock Holmes. Captain Al-Jamil leaned forward in his chair, the wood groaning softly under the strain. His uniform seemed heavy and dark in the stifling air, and the hope in his eyes was almost painful to witness. His tone was urgent, pleading. "Can you make sense of it, Mr. Sigerson?" "Our best men see nothing but gibberish," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed upon the strange array of dots, crescents, and angular marks. For the better part of an hour he had been lost in silent contemplation, his brow furrowed in a manner I knew well, the look of a grandmaster facing a board set by a worthy and unknown opponent. That is precisely the point. It is designed to appear as gibberish to a European mind. I have already applied the standard methodologies. A frequency analysis, for instance, yields nothing. In any alphabetic cipher, certain characters will appear with predictable regularity. Here, the distribution is almost perfectly uniform. "It is a statistical impossibility for a simple substitution," stated Sherlock Holmes. He tapped a long, thin finger on the paper, the sound a sharp little report in the quiet room. "Nor is it a Vigenin, or indeed any polyalphabetic system I have yet encountered. The patterns, while seemingly random, possess an underlying structure I can almost feel. It is not based on letters, it is based on something else entirely," observed Sherlock Holmes. The captain slumped back in his chair, the brief flicker of hope extinguished. The sound was one of utter defeat. "Then Bromley is doomed," he said, his voice heavy with despair. "Major Finch has already decided his guilt. This cipher is merely the nail for his coffin." Captain Karim Al-Jamil replied. Holmes looked up, his attention shifting entirely from the paper to the man. His eyes were sharp, analytical. "Tell me of this Major Finch." "A commander is quick to condemn a subordinate he trusts. The speed of this arrest suggests a pre-existing condition," remarked Sherlock Holmes. A bitter expression crossed Al-Jamil's face. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of stubble audible in the tense silence, as if weighing his words against the loyalty he owed his uniform. Finally, he spoke, his tone low and clipped with resentment. "Major Finch is a man who believes the world operates as it does in Surrey. He trusts what he knows and dismisses all else. He and Bromley, they clashed 6 months ago. Bromley argued that our maps of the Western Territories were dangerously inaccurate, based on the testimony of local guides. Finch dismissed it as native superstition. A patrol was nearly lost to a dry well as a result. Finch never forgave Bromley for being right," Captain Karim Al-Jamil replied. Holmes nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of understanding dawning in his eyes. He picked up the cipher once more, but his gaze seemed to look straight through it. "Prejudice. It is the most formidable of blindfolds. Finch sees a traitor in a man who embarrassed him, and he sees nonsense in a message he cannot comprehend. He is looking for a key in a London lock shop, "When the door itself was forged here in the heart of the Sudan," replied Sherlock Holmes. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards and making us both start. The very air in the room seemed to crackle, the energy shifting from quiet analysis to decisive action. "This paper has told us all it can for now," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound purpose. "Its secret lies not in the ink, but in the mind of the man who stands accused. Captain, you must arrange a visit. We are going to the military prison." "I must speak with Lieutenant Bromley," stated Sherlock Holmes. The unforgiving Sudanese sun had bleached all colour from the military stockade. Its whitewashed walls threw back a blinding glare, and the very air shimmered with heat. A heavy silence pressed down upon the compound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the distant, rhythmic stamp of a platoon at drill. Captain Al-Jamil, his face a grim mask, guided us past a pair of sentries, who snapped to attention at his approach. As we descended a short flight of stone steps, the air grew cooler, the scent of damp earth and disinfectant supplanting the dust of the parade ground. A final iron-barred door groaned open, its protest echoing down the narrow corridor. His voice was a low murmur, tight with strain. "He is in here, Mr. Sigerson." "They permit me only 10 minutes," Captain Karim Al-Jamil replied. The cell revealed itself as little more than a stone box, furnished only with a simple cot and a bucket. Lieutenant Arthur Bromley sat hunched on the edge of the cot, his head buried in his hands. He looked up as we entered, and the raw despair in his eyes struck me. I saw not the hardened face of a traitor, but the bewildered countenance of a boy trapped in a nightmare. Though handsome, with fair hair and a strong jaw, his uniform was rumpled, and his expression utterly broken. He scrambled to his feet, his voice cracking with emotion. "Karim! Thank God! Did you tell them? Did you explain it's all a monstrous mistake?" said Lieutenant Arthur Bromley. He replied gently, but firmly. "I am trying, Arthur. This is Mr. Sigerson. He is here to help us understand," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. My companion stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the tiny cell before settling on the young officer. He displayed no pity, only an intense, clinical focus. "Lieutenant Bromley," he began, his tone even and devoid of judgment, "we have little time. Tell me of the message. Where precisely was it discovered?" explained Sherlock Holmes. "In a book, a dusty old copy of von Clausewitz on my desk. Major Finch's men conducted a surprise inspection, tore my quarters apart. They found it slipped between the pages, as if I were using it as a bookmark. But I swear to you, Sigerson, I haven't touched that volume in weeks, months even. It was a prize from the Academy, nothing more than a paperweight," said Lieutenant Arthur Bromley. "You are quite certain you had not consulted it recently?" "A point of strategy, perhaps," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "With all due respect, sir, Major Finch's strategies leave little room for consultation." No, the book sat under a stack of requisitions. "I had no reason to open it," Lieutenant Arthur Bromley replied. Holmes fell silent for a moment, his eyes fixed upon the young man's face. The silence stretched, amplifying the sound of a dripping pipe somewhere down the corridor. When he finally spoke, addressing the captain and me, he never took his eyes off Bromley. "Observe the lieutenant's bearing. This is not the calculated poise of a conspirator. It is the frantic indignation of the unjustly accused. A true spy, upon discovery, would display either cold defiance or a feigned bewilderment. This man displays only raw, unvarnished shock." "He is a pawn, gentlemen, not a player," observed Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of hope ignited in Bromley's eyes. We were soon ushered out, the heavy door clanging shut behind us with dreadful finality. Back in the blinding sunlight, Captain Al-Jamil turned to Holmes, his expression fraught with desperate anxiety. "Then you believe him?" remarked Captain Karim Al-Jamil. He replied without hesitation, his voice sharp and decisive. "I do not believe he possesses the imagination or the subtlety for such a complex deception. The man who planted that message is our quarry. And the man who found it is the one we must question next," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his keen eyes narrowing against the glare as he looked towards the command headquarters. "Captain, you must arrange an audience for me with Major Alistair Finch. It is time we paid a visit to the Lion's Den." The interview with Lieutenant Bromley left a sour taste. We grappled with the shadow of a crime, its substance maddeningly elusive. Captain Al-Jamil led us from the military prison's stifling confines into the punishing glare of the Khartoum sun. The crunch of our boots on the gravel parade ground seemed the only sound to defy the oppressive, heat-laden silence, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic shouts of a distant drill sergeant. Major Alistair Finch's office was an island of stark British order amidst the swirling Sudanese dust. A large, ruthlessly organized mahogany desk dominated the space. Maps of the territory lined the walls with military precision. A slowly rotating ceiling fan stirred the air, which smelt of paper, leather, and polish. The man himself was much like his office, rigid, angular, and possessed of a distinct air of impatience. "Captain Al-Jamil, you have brought your associate, a Mr. Sigerson, I believe," Major Alistair Finch replied. "Yes, Major. Mr. Sigerson is a noted traveller with some experience in matters of cryptography. I thought he might offer a fresh perspective," replied Captain Karim Al-Jamil. "A fresh perspective is not required," Finch snapped, tapping a swagger stick against his thigh, with a short, sharp crack. "The case is closed. I ordered the inspection of Lieutenant Bromley's quarters myself, acting on a long-held suspicion regarding his character." The discovery of that message merely confirmed the obvious. "The man is a traitor," said Major Alistair Finch. This pronouncement hung in the air, absolute and final. My friend, however, remained entirely unperturbed. Holmes, in his guise as the weather-beaten explorer, leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "And the contents of the message?" "Major, you are entirely satisfied with the translation?" Sherlock Holmes noted. "Completely." He gestured dismissively towards a corner of the room, where a slender Sudanese man stood so still, he might have been mistaken for a piece of furniture. "Our translator, Idris al-Bashir, is perfectly competent. He assures me the text details troop movements." "There can be no other interpretation," replied Major Alistair Finch. As Finch spoke, Holmes's attention drifted from the Major to the silent translator. Idris kept his eyes fixed upon the floor, a picture of meek subservience, a quiet shadow in the room. Following my friend's gaze, I soon understood his interest. It was not the man's posture or expression, but something more subtle. For a fleeting second, the translator's eyes flickered up, revealing not meekness, but a spark of intense, calculating observation. Then I noticed the other detail, a faint, silvery scar just at his hairline of a type one could not place. "I see," Holmes said, his voice betraying nothing of his discovery. "You have been most thorough, Major. Your confidence is impressive," Sherlock Holmes responded. The dismissal was palpable. A curt gesture ushered us out, the heavy office door closing behind us with a definitive thud. Back in the courtyard, the sun felt hotter, the air more suffocating. Captain Al-Jamil looked utterly defeated. "He will not be reasoned with," he murmured, his voice heavy with frustration. "His mind is a fortress," Captain Karim Al-Jamil replied. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the bustling city beyond the barracks walls. "And one does not lay siege to a fortress without first understanding the surrounding terrain." "Major Finch's certainty is his greatest weakness," stated Sherlock Holmes. He paused, turning his gaze from the rigid lines of the military garrison to the chaotic, vibrant life of Khartoum. "We have exhausted the utility of official channels. The key to this puzzle does not lie in a soldier's office, Watson. It lies out there, in the heart of the city itself. Come, we shall go to the souk." We returned from our interview with Major Finch to the stifling confines of our quarters. The Major's dismissive words hung in the air like dust motes in the oppressive heat. I had rarely seen Holmes so agitated. He paced the room, his long fingers steepled one moment, then raking through his hair the next. The memory of the translator, Idris al-Bashir, his peculiar scar and watchful stillness, seemed to unsettle Holmes more than Finch's open hostility. "It is no use, Watson. We are trying to decipher a hieroglyph with a Latin primer. The logic is wrong. The method is flawed. The very air in that office suffocates the truth." Sherlock Holmes noted. He stopped his pacing and snatched his pith helmet from the table. The decisive action shattered his coiled stillness. "We will find nothing more within these four walls. The key to Bromley's cipher is not in military codebooks. It is out there, in the living, breathing heart of this city. Come, the game is afoot, and on a field of play I have hitherto failed to appreciate," Sherlock Holmes said. Minutes later we plunged into the maelstrom of the Khartoum souk. It was a pure assault on the senses. The air, thick with cumin and roasting coffee, was pierced by the high-pitched haggling of vendors. A rhythmic clang from a coppersmith's stall provided percussion to the cacophony of voices, braying donkeys and bleating goats. Blazing sunlight sliced through the narrow alleyways, creating brilliant shards of light in the dark. At first, Holmes seemed merely to absorb the chaos, but his keen eyes were not idle. I saw them dart from the intricate weave of a textile to the geometric inlay on a wooden chest, then to the chalk lines of a children's game on the packed earth. He was not looking at the people, he was looking at the patterns they created, the very shapes of their lives and labors. He halted abruptly before a stall of carved wooden ornaments. His gaze was not on the merchandise, but on a simple repeating diamond motif carved into the lintel. He stood so still that the river of humanity was forced to part around him. "I have been a fool. An absolute fool. I have been searching for a complex linguistic key, an alphabetical substitution, a transpositional cipher. All the comfortable methods of Scotland Yard and the capitals of Europe," replied Sherlock Holmes. He turned to me, his grey eyes alight with a fire I had not seen since we left London. The frustration had vanished, replaced by the pure, cold flame of intellectual pursuit. "Do you see, Watson? It is everywhere. A logic of shape and position, of lines and intersections. I have been trying to read a message written in the language of chess, as if it were a common telegram. The meaning is not in the symbols themselves, but in their placement, their relationship to one another. The mind that devised this cipher does not think as Major Finch does. It thinks in patterns," Sherlock Holmes noted. His profound realization settled between us. He had stripped away his preconceptions, at last seeing the problem through the eyes of its creator. At that precise moment, a sharp voice cut through the din from a nearby alcove. The Arabic words carried not the cadence of commerce, but the sting of tactical debate. A man's voice rose in exasperation. It was a foolish move that left the center open. Holmes froze. His head cocked like a hound catching a new scent on the wind. His eyes narrowed, scanning the crowd until they settled upon the source of the dispute. Two men on low stools, their attention consumed by a simple gridded board and a collection of smooth, dark stones. Following the epiphany that had struck him amidst the market's chaos, Holmes moved with a renewed and unsettling purpose. He was no longer the bewildered European overwhelmed by the souk, but a hunter upon the scent. He guided me away from the clamorous central artery of the bazaar. His eyes scanned not the wares, but the patterns of men, the way they gathered, the rhythms of their haggling, the very geometry of their daily lives. The air hung thick with the scent of ground cumin and hot dust, and the drone of 1,000 conversations was a constant hum in our ears. As we passed a stall piled high with colourful bolts of cotton, a sharp, aggrieved voice cut through the din. Two merchants, their faces inches apart, were locked in a heated dispute over a ledger. "It was a foolish move," one exclaimed, stabbing a finger at the book. "A foolish move that left the centre open for him to take everything." His companion threw up his hands in disgust. Holmes stopped dead. The sudden stillness in his frame was so absolute, it was as if he had turned to stone. I drew alongside him. "Some trade disagreement, Holmes?" Dr. John Watson inquired. His reply was a low murmur, his gaze fixed on the distant argument. "Listen to the words, Watson. Not the anger, the words. A foolish move. Left the center open. Does that sound to you like the language of a man who has been cheated on the price of cotton? Or does it sound like the language of a general who has lost a battle?" explained Sherlock Holmes. Before I could formulate a reply, he was off, plunging down a narrow, shaded alleyway I had not previously noticed. The sounds of the main market faded, replaced by a more subdued atmosphere. Here old men sat on woven mats in the slivers of shade afforded by the mud-brick walls. And in the center of one such gathering, my eyes fell upon the source of a curious rhythmic sound. It was a sharp, distinct clack of stone against wood, repeated every few moments. Two men knelt on either side of a simple wooden board, upon which a grid of 5x5 squares had been crudely etched. They used small, smooth stones as their pieces, one set dark, one light. Their concentration was absolute, their faces masks of placid intensity. Their hands moved with swift, economical grace. They placed their stones, captured their opponents, and repositioned for the next assault. The silence between them was broken only by that sharp clack, a sound that seemed to hold all the weight of their silent contest. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, so as not to disturb the players. "Observe, Watson. It is a game called Siger. Its components are simple. A handful of stones, a few lines in the dust. Yet I perceive its strategic depth to be immense. The board is small, forcing constant engagement. Victory, I surmise, is not about brute force, but about position. It is about controlling that vital central square," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He pointed with his chin. "The cipher that has so baffled military intelligence is also arranged in a 5x5 grid. We have been searching for a key in alphanumeric tables and literary ciphers, Watson, the tools of European espionage. We have been trying to open a lock with the wrong key entirely," Sherlock Holmes noted. His eyes shone with the fierce light of discovery. "The key is not a word. It is a system of movement, a set of rules for a silent war fought on a field of 25 squares. The logic we seek is not in our libraries, but here, in the dust of a Khartoum marketplace," declared Sherlock Holmes. The weight of his words hung in the dry air between us. The solution, so elegant, and yet so alien to our way of thinking, had been here all along. Holmes fell silent then, utterly absorbed in the swift, silent dance of the stones. A player would sacrifice a piece to gain a superior position. His opponent would counter with a subtle trap. 2 moves in the making. It was a language of pure, cold strategy. I knew with certainty that Holmes was already becoming fluent. He had found his path, and I sensed we were but one step away from identifying the man who had used this ancient game to betray an empire. My friend's fascination with the game of Siger had held us captive for the better part of an hour. We stood at the periphery of a dense circle of onlookers in the Khartoum souk, the air thick with the scent of roasted coffee and arid dust. The low hum of bartering was a constant accompaniment to the sharp, decisive clack of stone upon wood, a sound that seemed to cut through all others. Holmes, however, was no longer watching the board itself. His gaze, intense and unnervingly still, was fixed upon one of the 2 players. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the crowd. "Do you recognize that man, Watson? The one with the grey stones," declared Sherlock Holmes. I peered through a gap between 2 robed figures. The player was a slender man, his concentration so absolute that he seemed oblivious to the world around him. His face was familiar, yet I could not immediately place it. He sat with a posture as straight and rigid as a soldier on parade, his eyes darting across the 5x5 grid with a fiery intelligence. His hand moved with an astonishing economy of motion, his long fingers plucking a stone from one square and setting it down in another, with a speed and precision that was almost hypnotic. "He has a familiar cast to his features," I admitted, "but I cannot say from where." "He carries himself with such authority," Dr. John Watson commented. "Authority is precisely the word," Holmes breathed, a note of profound discovery in his tone. "Now, imagine that same man with a stoop. Imagine his eyes perpetually downcast, his hands clasped deferentially, his voice a meek whisper. Picture him translating Major Finch's blustering commands with a timid air," Sherlock Holmes noted. The pieces clicked into place in my own mind, a sudden, startling clarity washing over me. The hawk-like strategist before me, commanding his small stone army with the genius of a Napoleon, was none other than Idris al-Bashir, the quiet, unassuming translator from the garrison office. The contrast was so staggering as to be almost unbelievable. The man I had seen in Finch's presence was a shadow, a creature of timid deference. This man was a king upon his throne. "Good heavens, Holmes! It is him! But the transformation, it is absolute," commented Dr. John Watson. As if to punctuate my astonishment, Idris made his final move. He placed a single stone, trapping his opponent's last piece. The move was not merely a victory, it was an elegant, flawless execution that drew a collective gasp from the spectators. His opponent threw up his hands in a gesture of surrender and admiration. For a single moment, a flicker of triumph, cold and brilliant, lit Idris's face. It was the briefest of glimpses behind a meticulously crafted curtain. Then, as he began to gather the stones, the light vanished. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fell to the ground, and the master strategist dissolved, replaced once more by the humble clerk. "The cipher, Watson," he said, his voice now sharp and brimming with a sudden fierce energy. "Consider the mind that constructed it. It is not the work of a blunt instrument, but of a master of misdirection and intricate logic. A mind that thinks several moves ahead, that anticipates every possible counter, that sets traps within traps. We have been searching for a soldier with the mind of a cryptographer. We should have been searching for a grandmaster who masquerades as a pawn," replied Sherlock Holmes. He turned away from the dispersing crowd, his questing grey eyes already scanning the market stalls. The sounds of the souk seemed to fade, as the immensity of his implications settled upon me. The key to Bromley's innocence and England's security did not lie in a codebook, but in the rules of a simple game of stones, as played by a man of two faces. "Come, Watson. Our work for the day is not yet done. I must procure a board and a set of pieces immediately. There is a language here I must learn to speak, and I suspect I have very little time in which to become fluent," stated Sherlock Holmes. Upon our return from the bazaar, a palpable change had come over Holmes. The weariness of our journey seemed shed like a heavy coat, replaced by a feverish, almost predatory, energy. He had procured his prize, a simple wooden board, its surface marked with a 5x5 grid, and a pouch of smooth-worn stones, half of them dark, half of them light. This was the native game of Siger, the source of the translator Idris al-Bashir's unlikely genius. He said not a word, but set about his task with a singular focus that I knew better than to interrupt. The air in our quarters was thick and still, the night outside holding the day's oppressive heat. A single oil lamp was placed upon the table, casting a pool of dancing yellow light and throwing Holmes's hawk-like features into sharp relief. Its low hiss was accompanied by the frantic buzz of a moth, battering itself against the glass. For a quarter of an hour he did nothing but study the board itself, arranging the stones in various configurations. He consulted a small page of notes, scribbled in his own peculiar shorthand, no doubt a summary of the rules he had gleaned from the vendor at the bazaar. He was not merely learning a pastime, he was internalizing a system of logic, a language of strategy spoken in wood and stone. Satisfied, he set the notes aside. He then unrolled the fateful parchment containing Lieutenant Bromley's supposed treason, that damnable cipher which had so thoroughly baffled the military's finest minds. Beside it he placed a fresh sheet of paper, upon which he had already drawn a perfect replica of the Siger grid. Now, the true work began. The only sound in the room for the best part of an hour was the dry scratch of his quill pen as it moved across the paper. He was not attempting to decipher the message in any conventional sense. Instead, with painstaking precision, he was transcribing it. Each cryptic symbol from the original message was being converted, not into a letter of the alphabet, but into a coordinate upon the grid. What had appeared as meaningless scribbles now took on a new form, a sequence of positions, a pattern of locations upon the field of play. When the transcription was complete, he pushed the papers aside and drew the wooden board into the center of the light. From the pouch he produced the stones. He took a dark one between his long, nimble fingers and placed it upon one of the squares he had marked. A soft but distinct click of stone on wood echoed in the quiet room. He placed another, and then another, his lips moving silently as he followed the sequence dictated by the cipher. The opening, unconventional, but not without a certain brutal logic. He sacrificed his position for an immediate threat. Deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hand hovered over the board, a pale spider against the dark wood. He was no longer merely plotting points. He was reenacting a game. The random characters of the cipher were resolving themselves into a series of tactical moves and countermoves. I watched, mesmerized, as the seemingly chaotic message revealed an underlying structure, a silent intellectual battle played out in code and now replayed in stone. For another hour he continued, his breathing steady, the rhythmic click of the stones marking the passage of time. Then he stopped. His hand froze mid-air. His eyes, which had been narrowed in focus, suddenly widened, and I saw in them the unmistakable brilliant flare of discovery. A sharp intake of breath cut through the stillness. With a final, deliberate motion, he placed a single white stone upon the central square of the board, a move of such finality and triumph that it seemed to checkmate the very night itself. He looked up at me, the lamplight glinting in his grey eyes, and a thin, grim smile touched his lips. The stillness of the Khartoum night pressed in upon the small room. The only sounds were the hiss of the lamp and the maddeningly deliberate click of a stone upon wood. For hours I had watched the man who called himself Sigerson, my last hope, as he hunched over a crude Seeger board. His face, a mask of concentration, was etched in the harsh interplay of light and shadow. The coded dispatch, the very ruin of a good officer's career, lay smoothed beside him. Its strange symbols seemed to mock my own futile attempt to decipher them. Finally, he leaned back, letting out a soft breath of satisfaction, not fatigue. The scrape of his chair on the stone floor was a thunderclap in the silence. He fixed his piercing gaze upon me, and for the first time in a day, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. "It is a work of diabolical genius, Captain." "A trap constructed not of steel, but of prejudice," Sherlock Holmes responded. "Then you have found something. Does it exonerate Bromley?" I asked, my voice tight with strain. Responded Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes held up a single, long finger, silencing my impatience. He tapped the incriminating dispatch. "On the contrary, when decoded using standard military methods, it condemns him utterly. They would find a simple key, perhaps hidden in his personal effects, and feel quite clever for it. The message they would uncover is precisely the one Major Finch suspects," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. My heart sank. Holmes picked up a piece of paper upon which he had scrawled a translation, then pushed it across the table towards me. The lamplight illuminated the stark, treacherous words. "Supply column vulnerable, West Road, Tuesday." The message is unambiguous. It is treason. It is also a complete fabrication, a piece of bait for a mind that refuses to see beyond its own assumptions, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "Bait? I do not understand," I replied, my frustration mounting. "If the message is there, how can it be false?" said Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes's eyes glittered. He gestured not to the paper, but to the Seeger board, its surface now occupied by a precise arrangement of stones. Because it is not a message written in letters, Captain. It is a message written in positions. Your commanders see this game as a native pastime, a mere trifle. They would never conceive that it possesses a strategic language as complex as chess. The cipher, you see, is designed to be read in two ways. The first is a crude mask for the ignorant. The second, however, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He began to move the stones on the board, his fingers deft and certain. Each symbol on the dispatch corresponded not to a letter, but to a coordinate, a specific move in a sequence. What had been gibberish was now a silent, deadly ballet of flanking maneuvers and tactical captures. When read not as a substitution cipher, but as a sequence of Siger moves, the true instructions are revealed. They are not concerned with a supply column at all. The actual intelligence is far more immediate, and far more lethal, Sherlock Holmes responded. A cold dread crept up my spine as I watched the final move play out on the board, a devastating checkmate. Holmes looked up from the game. His voice dropped to a low, grave tone that chilled me to the bone. The real message reads, "Ambush Finch's patrol at Jebel Aulia Gorge." "Friday dawn," observed Sherlock Holmes. The silence in Holmes's quarters was heavier than the oppressive Khartoum heat. Outside, the city's sounds had faded to a low thrum. Within our small room, however, the only movement was a column of dust motes dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light. Captain Al-Jamil stood as if turned to stone, his gaze fixed on the decoded message, a death warrant for Major Finch and his patrol. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry rasp. "An ambush. At the gorge." "This is not mere spying. This is a massacre in the making," Captain Karim Al-Jamil said. Holmes rose and began to pace, his slippered feet silent upon the worn rug. His energy had returned, his eyes alight with the cold fire of intellectual certainty. "It is more than that, Captain. It is a masterstroke. We have been gravely mistaken in our estimation of our adversary. Idris al-Bashir is no common informant, selling secrets for a handful of silver. He is a strategist, a high-level operative executing a gambit of the Khalifa's own design," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused by the window, his silhouette stark against the glare. "This entire affair has been a calculated move on a grand board. First, frame a competent British officer to sow discord and remove a capable mind from the field. Second, use the ensuing confusion to pass along the true, fatal instructions under the very noses of your victims. It is brilliant precisely because it preys upon the arrogance of men like Major Finch, who cannot conceive of such subtlety from an enemy they deem unsophisticated," replied Sherlock Holmes. "But the message itself," Karim pressed, his brow furrowed in consternation. "How did it find its way into Bromley's possession?" "He is adamant he had never seen it before it was discovered," Captain Karim Al-Jamil replied. Holmes turned from the window, a thin smile on his lips. He tapped a long finger against the table, the sound a sharp report in the quiet. "Simplicity itself. Consider the man's role, the quiet translator, the humble local servant. Who is more trusted, more invisible within these headquarters? Idris has daily, unquestioned access to the Major's office. He enters to deliver a document, and, when unobserved, slips the folded paper into a book on Lieutenant Bromley's desk. He knew Finch's prejudices would do the rest. Once a coded message was found, suspicion would fall upon the nearest European, never upon the native man who serves his tea," Sherlock Holmes said. "The scheme's sheer audacity left me breathless. A plot relying entirely on being underestimated." Karim's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set like granite. "Then, we must go to Finch at once. We must expose Idris before he can do more harm," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes's voice was low and sharp, cutting through the captain's impassioned plea. "And say what?" "That his trusted translator is a master spy and the key to it all is a board game he scoffs at. He would have you placed in irons next to Bromley. No, we cannot simply tell him the truth. We must make him see it for himself," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes leaned forward, his expression intense. The air crackled with the energy of his plan taking shape. "Idris provides the Major with regular intelligence briefings, I presume. We shall arrange to be present at the next one. We will give him the stage to spin his web of lies. And at the precise moment of his triumph, we will spring our trap. We will force him to play one final game." A grim understanding settled over Captain Al-Jamil's features. The path ahead was perilous, yet his resolve did not waver. A newfound steel entered his tone. "I will arrange it. I will tell the Major you have made a critical breakthrough in Bromley's case. He will protest, but I will not be denied." "It is time I faced my commanding officer," answered Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Without another word he turned on his heel and left. The sharp sound of his boots marching down the corridor echoed his new purpose. He was heading for a confrontation that would determine all our fates. We found Major Finch's office to be an oasis of strained order amidst the Khartoum heat. A sluggish ceiling fan did little more than stir the thick air, its rhythmic creak a dreary accompaniment to our purpose. Captain Al-Jamil's hand was steady as he rapped sharply upon the door, and without waiting for a reply, he pushed it open. The scene within was precisely as Holmes had predicted. Major Finch stood hunched over a vast map of the territories, his face florid with a mixture of heat and frustration. Beside him, pointing a slender finger at a position north of the city, was the translator, Idris al-Bashir, his expression one of quiet deference. The Major looked up, his eyes narrowing with fury at our intrusion. His voice was a low growl. "Al-Jamil! What is the meaning of this intrusion, and you bring this meddling interloper with you?" "I am in the midst of a critical briefing," said Major Alistair Finch. "It is that very briefing we have come to interrupt, Major," Karim replied, his tone firm and devoid of its usual deference. "You are being dangerously misinformed," said Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Before Finch could erupt, Holmes stepped forward, placing a simple wooden board, its surface clearly etched with a 5x5 grid, upon the corner of the desk. The sudden, solid sound of the wood against the polished mahogany drew every eye. Idris al-Bashir flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that did not escape my friend's notice. "A child's game, you might call it, Major," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the tension with academic precision. "Seeger. But in the right hands it is a language all its own. The message for which you condemned Lieutenant Bromley read N3, E5, W2. A simple grid cipher, is it not?" remarked Sherlock Holmes. "It is an order to move our forces into a trap." "It is treason, plain and simple," Finch sputtered, jabbing a finger towards the board as if it were the accused himself. Replied Major Alistair Finch. "Indeed it appears so. North 3 squares, east 5, west 2. A military directive. But you have failed to appreciate, Major, that a message can have two meanings, particularly when the sender knows the receiver will only look for one." "You searched for a European code, and so you found one," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Holmes produced a handful of smooth, river-worn stones, and began placing them on the board with deliberate, almost hypnotic clicks against the wood. These numbers do not merely represent coordinates. To a master of this game, they represent the opening moves of a famous strategy. A strategy known as the patient scorpion. It is not an order, Major, it is a report. He tapped the final stone into place with a decisive clack. The room was utterly silent, save for the groaning fan, as Holmes fixed his gaze upon the translator. "Read not as coordinates, but as moves in a game, the message is transformed. It becomes, British forces move north. 3 regiments. A feint to the west. Information, Major. Not instruction. Information sent from a spy in your own command to his true master," explained Sherlock Holmes. The colour drained from Major Finch's face. He stared, speechless, first at the board, then at the unassuming translator beside him. For the first time, I saw the mask of quiet servitude fall from Idris al-Bashir. His eyes darted towards the door, a flicker of pure panic in their depths. His hand shot out, snatching for a heavy brass paperweight on the desk. But Captain Al-Jamil was faster. With the swift, economic motion of a seasoned soldier, he seized Idris's wrist, twisting it until the paperweight clattered to the floor. In the next instant, the spy was pinned against the wall, the fight draining out of him as he stared into the captain's unforgiving eyes. His voice was cold steel. "Your game is over, Idris," replied Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Major Finch simply stood there, his mouth agape, his rigid authority shattered into 1,000 pieces. He looked at the Seeger board, the simple key to a deception that had nearly cost him a good officer and a vital military advantage, and I saw the devastating comprehension of his own folly dawn in his eyes. The Khalifa's Gambit had been exposed, and the office was filled with a profound and terrible silence. The tale of the Khalifa's Gambit, as Holmes recounted it to me months later, in the familiar fog-bound comfort of our Baker Street rooms, concluded not with the snap of handcuffs, but in the quiet aftermath. In the great, dusty courtyard of the Khartoum barracks, the oppressive tension of the past days had finally broken. The harsh afternoon sun beat down upon the packed earth, and the rhythmic tramp of the guardsman marching the spy Idris al-Bashir to his cell was already a fading echo. A door to the main administrative building creaked open, and Lieutenant Arthur Bromley stepped out, blinking in the fierce light. He was a man returned from the precipice, his uniform immaculate once more, but his face pale and etched with the strain of his ordeal. He saw Captain Al-Jamil and Holmes standing near the central well, and took a hesitant step towards them. Before he could speak, however, another figure emerged from the shadows of the colonnade. Major Alistair Finch strode forward, his posture as rigid as ever, the crunch of his boots on the gravel, the only sound in the yard. He stopped before the small group, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond them, struggling to reconcile a man's honor with a commander's pride. His voice, when it came, was a strained and formal thing, stripped of its usual bluster. "Lieutenant Bromley, you are to return to your duties at once. Your record is cleared of all suspicion. There has been a regrettable error," said Major Alistair Finch. Bromley's own voice was hoarse with emotion. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you," responded Lieutenant Arthur Bromley. The Major gave a curt nod, a dismissal that was also an admission. Then, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him dearly, he turned his attention to Captain Al-Jamil. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Captain, your persistence in this matter and your trust in your consultant have prevented a grave injustice and averted a significant threat. My apologies for questioning your methods." "You have served the Crown well," answered Major Alistair Finch. Karim's reply was simple and direct, his dignity a quiet rebuke to the Major's former prejudice. "I served my friend, and my duty, Major. They have always been one and the same," said Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Finch offered no response, but turned on his heel and marched back into the shade of his office, with Bromley following in his wake. As the heavy door clicked shut, a profound silence descended once more, broken only by the distant mournful call to evening prayer that began to drift across the city from a minaret. The sky was already bleeding into hues of orange and violet. Holmes, still in the guise of the Norwegian explorer Sigerson, drew a long breath. His voice was low, filled with a quiet awe. He saw only a game of stones on a board. "How could you see a battlefield?" responded Captain Karim Al-Jamil. Holmes gestured towards the city beyond the barracks wall, his tone becoming analytical once more. "Because the error was not in the cipher, my dear Karim, but in the perspective of those who sought to solve it." Major Finch saw Idris al-Bashir not as a man, but as a functionary, a native translator, a quaint player of a local pastime. He could not conceive that a mind he considered unsophisticated could devise a stratagem of such elegance, replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his keen eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. Their dismissal of his culture was the very blind spot he exploited. They searched for a key in European codebooks. when all along it lay in plain sight, in the movements of a game played in every market square in this city. The Major's prejudice was not merely a moral failing, it was a catastrophic tactical blunder. That, I find, is often the case, Sherlock Holmes noted, and it was there, in his telling of the tale, that Holmes concluded the events in the Sudan. But he had one final piece to share. He rose from his chair, retrieved a leather-bound journal from his desk, and opened it to a specific page. The rustle of the crisp paper was the only sound in our quiet room. He read in a steady, reflective voice, "Khartoum. The case is closed. I have seen tonight that the most formidable prison is not one of stone, but one of the mind, built from the bricks of arrogance and mortared with ignorance. It is a lesson in humility I shall not soon forget. I must remember to relate this curious affair to Watson upon my return. He has a keen appreciation for cases wherein the greatest puzzle is not one of intellect, but of the human spirit," Sherlock Holmes said.